A Scary Camping Trip by Dr. Jim Danger. When I was about 18, me and some friends took a road trip about 7 hours or so down to the Apalachicola National Forest near Tallahassee, Florida. We were going to do a little car camping, drink a few ice-cold natty lights, 18-year-old stuff. As such, we didn't want to be bothered by any park rangers, so we drove way deep into the woods. We got there, set up camp, had said natty lights, and me and a guy decided to go do a little exploring. So we walked about 100 yards from our site back to the main road, and saw another path directly across from us and started walking. Immediately, we started seeing signs that someone had lived there for quite a while. Big bags of trash, stuff like that. Should have been a huge red flag to turn around. But, 18. Nothing could hurt us. So we get to this campsite of an older white guy living out of his van. Clotheslines strung up, coolers placed around it, and a big, gorgeous dog. I think maybe a golden retriever. We tried to back out, but he saw us and started talking. He was friendly enough, asked us where we were from, told us about some cool spots to check out in the park, and we ended up chatting for about 10 minutes and then going on our way. I kept thinking to myself how odd it was that he gave directions in steps, not yards or miles. And the guy always seemed to be off balance. Not stumbling drunk, but like he was walking on a balance beam, swaying side to side. Oh, and he was super excited to talk about national parks and forests where we were from. Okay, camping part over. We went back to our tents, and fast forward 2 months, the same buddy called me late at night and told me to turn on the TV to the news. I obliged. I saw an old dude with a van. You see where this is headed, but I didn't at the time. So I get pissed at my friend for waking me up. And he says, "No, watch." And then I see the golden retriever, and it all clicks. What the fuck? That man's name was Gary Michael Hilton, convicted of at least 4 murders. He kidnapped and murdered a girl on Blood Mountain, Georgia, an older couple in Pisgah, North Carolina, and a girl in the Apalachicola at that campsite not long after we left. Yeah, the very same places he had all been talking to us about. Obviously, we called the cops. They put us in touch with the FBI, and we got flown down to take investigators to the campsite. We pointed out every spot we saw anything, told them exactly what he told us, and showed them the places he described to us. I didn't find out until after the trial, but apparently they found what appeared to be partially destroyed human finger bones in an area near the site. We had to fly down again to testify. Hiking the Pacific Coast Trail. The story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and was acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hiking, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far from help. Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007, and I immediately fell in love. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week living in my parents' house, and the movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes and black bears, experienced dehydration, but nothing happened that made me fear for my life. Somewhere in the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in the trail only to be startled by two people sitting on a rock, dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long, unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. And what struck me as odd about the encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun, and their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru-hikers abandon personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing and simply watched me as I passed by. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign and not knowing what to say, and I camped a few hundred yards off the trail that night as I always did. Following bear precautions, I hung my leftover food I had cooked that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there. I immediately thought a bear had entered my campsite, so I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find paw prints, but I did find boot prints circling the campsite. 2 pairs of boot prints. One of those set of prints led right up to the rope from which the food was hanging. I thought of the couple I had passed earlier, and everything clicked. I quickly packed up and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured the couple was simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for more than just the food. Several days passed, and my mind was at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of an intruder, animal or otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise is much more likely an animal than a person. Then I heard frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. Being in the dark, surrounded by trees 100 miles from the nearest city, plays tricks on your senses. I debated yelling out, claiming to have a gun, but instead decided to be silent and retain the benefit of surprise. I heard footsteps circling my tent and was ready to slash whatever or whoever opened it. But just like that, it was over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lay frozen awake in my tent until sunrise and opened my tent to find nobody there. The only evidence something had actually happened were the boot prints, the same as before. Several more days passed and I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail, and being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line, I could see the trail winding for miles in front of and behind me. I stopped for water in the rare shade and noticed 2 hikers miles behind me. All I could see were 2 white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately said out loud, "Fuck this. This trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Castella, located off I-5. The only problem was, that was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night, trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got in my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours in my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night. The footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of other sound. I knew they were close, but wasn't sure how close. And all I could think was, this is fucked up. This is so fucked up. God damn it! Finally, a flashlight hits my tent and lights up the entire thing, and then goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out carrying my knife, yelling nonsense into the dark. It was sort of like that cliché scene in movies where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them, and the camera pans around the trees, because the people have no idea where the direction of the sound is coming from. Then I heard footsteps running towards the tent, and barely made out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into several trees. After running for approximately 5 minutes, I tripped, rolled, and came to rest next to a downed tree. I got under the tree trunk and laid still. I saw the flashlight moving around in the distance, and I laid under that tree for hours. I was certain they were gone, but I didn't move. Eventually, birds started chirping, and I knew sunrise would come soon. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail, abandoned my campsite, and walked the rest of the distance to Costella, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way to the town of Mount Shasta and spoke with the police and Forest Service. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and Forest Service months later, who told me there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terrorizing that I had experienced. As far as I know, nothing ever came of that couple. Labor Day Trouble. Just this past Labor Day weekend, we took our canoe down to Waldo Lake. 3 nights, 3 different campsites on the south end of the lake. At campsite number 2, we thought we had a ton of solitude, but at about 7 p.m., a rowboat, not a canoe or kayak, pulled up to the shoreline not 300 feet south of us. Now, when there's no other people within a half mile of your camp, 300 feet seems a tad close. But I figured, hey, as long as they're cool, I'm cool. But at about midnight, my wife woke me up. Hey, did you hear that? Hear what? The people camping over there are fighting. Fighting? What do you mean fighting? Sure enough, I could hear cussing and yelling and stuff being thrown around. Obviously, there was a lot of booze being consumed, and they weren't like that when they arrived. They would go silent for a minute, then start right back up again. They were far enough away that I couldn't quite make out what was being said, but then I clearly heard a female yell out, "I'm gonna fucking kill you!" Silence for a minute. Then a gunshot. We lay there in horror. Did we just hear someone get murdered? I mean, what should we do? What can we do? We're literally in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road, in the pitch dark. And someone over there, not too far away, still has a gun. About 20 seconds of silence. More cussing and screaming. Evidently, it was a warning shot. At first light, we packed up camp, hopped in our canoe, and went down shore a good mile away from those drunks and their firearms. My Hiking Story by SPG. My girlfriend at the time and I were on a backpacking trip through northern Vermont. 10 days of hiking and camping in the great outdoors. We were carrying everything we needed for the entire trip, food, supplies, etc. And we weren't planning on leaving the trail at all. I've been doing outdoor stuff my entire life and feel very comfortable on trips like this. My girlfriend had done a decent amount of hiking and camping, but had never been on a trip this long. Honestly, I was totally psyched to have a girlfriend interested in this sort of thing. My previous girlfriends had been good for a day hike, but that was about it. Anyway, the woods, and more importantly, weather, were beautiful, and everything on our trip was going great. Our routine was pretty simple. We'd hike around 15 miles during the day, and when it started to get a bit dark, we'd hike off the trail into the woods a few hundred yards or so, and find a nice flat place to set up our tent for the night. It's always surprising to me how alone you can be out in the woods. The first few days, we saw maybe 3 or 4 other hikers each day, usually just walking by us in the opposite direction. By the 4th day, we had stopped seeing other hikers at all, and this is because we had hiked farther north by this point, into a more secluded area that gets a lot less foot traffic. So it's the 7th night, and we haven't seen anyone else for probably 3 or 4 days. I fell asleep and woke up very early, as I do while camping. Typically, I had just been lying in my sleeping bag waiting for my girlfriend to wake up. But while I was laying there, I heard a noise outside of our tent of something walking around. We were pretty close to the edge of a river or a lake, and I was excited thinking that I might get to see a moose. I got out of the tent as quietly as I could, and it was still dark out. The sun was not yet up. My eyes were used to the low light, so I scanned around for a moose or other animal, but didn't see anything. Eventually, I made something out, though, because of its movement. There was a man standing about 100 feet from where our tent was, and as I watched, he simply turned off and walked into the woods. You know that feeling you get on a roller coaster when everything drops out from under you? I had that exact same feeling out in the woods, and had no idea what to do. A lot of possibilities were racing through my head. Was he a hunter or a random camper who just stumbled onto our tent? And if so, why was he out here so early in the morning? The sun wasn't even up yet. I checked my watch. It was 4 a.m. If he wasn't a hunter, were we unintentionally on his property? Was he pissed at us? Why didn't he say anything? I was having trouble coming up with explanations that made sense and weren't just completely terrifying. What was this guy's deal? I ended up getting my girlfriend up a lot earlier than normal, and we hiked lots of extra miles that day. I have no idea if that guy was following us or what, and I spent all day looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him every single time coming up from behind. Of course, nothing happened, and we finished out the trip safely. But the vision of this guy walking off into the shadowy woods is still completely etched into my mind years later. Rednecks in the Swamp, submitted by Terry Bazio, fan 72. When I was about 25 in 2001, some friends and I wanted to go camping, but not at a campground or anything like that. We wanted to just be out where no one else was and hang out with some brews and a few fatties and do some fishing, etc. This happened in Louisiana, the Honey Island area, and no, this isn't about the supposed swamp monster because there is no such thing. And to be honest, this was scarier than any tale of skunk apes could possibly be. My friends Link, Brian, and Heath and I got together, and Heath's dad worked at a place on the Pearl River that was deserted on the weekends. We got permission to park our trucks at the business, and we were going to hoof it through some woods and go to a place on the bank of the river away from civilization. It wasn't in the middle of the swamp, more on the edge of it. The nearest town to the south was Slidell, but the Mississippi state line wasn't too far away either. We packed up a bunch of food, beer, our fishing gear, and of course, some herb. It was about 6:30 in the evening on a Friday night in July, and it was hotter than hell out and humid. We parked at the place and then started hauling out our stuff out along an old beat-up trail that led to a clearing on the river. Heath's dad told him that there was a skiff out there that a coworker left for people to use if they wanted to, and we could check that out too. It took us a bit to get out there as we were all dragging coolers on wheels with the food and stuff, but when we got there we immediately put up 2 tents and had some brews. We needed to get firewood before it got dark, and once we had enough for the night, I fired up a J and Link got a campfire going. We all sat around eating some sandwiches we brought, sucking on beer and slowly getting toasted. It was heaven. We had some Zeppelin playing on a CD player, and the night came down with us, just relaxing and shooting the shit. It was late when we decided to hit the sack, but we wanted to get up early and take the skiff out for some fishing, so we didn't really party that hard on that first night. Some people might say we were crazy for camping out there with the snakes and bears and such, but to be honest, I rarely saw anything like that. I mean, I had seen them, but they never really bother you if you don't mess with them. Heath and I were sharing a tent, and I think it's important at this point to mention that Heath is black. Our families had been friends since before we were born, and we still all are today. We were best men in each other's weddings, and Link was part of the party too when we got married later on in life. To this day, I'd do anything for these two men and their families. But unfortunately, not everyone around our town thought the same way, despite it being the 2000s. Link was up before us and had checked out the skiff. There was a motor on it, and a big can of gas was in a wooden box next to it, so we were set there. We ate some breakfast, and then grabbed one cooler and filled it with beer and water and snacks and stuff, and then got our gear in the skiff for a day of fishing. The Pearl is a tricky river sometimes, and the currents take a bit of getting used to, and the fishing is the same. But there's good bass and crappie fishing out there, so we put our bets on getting some dinner. It was cloudier than the day before and not as hot, and a little breeze kept things cool even though it was Louisiana in July. The day went on as we caught a bunch of panfish and meandered around the river having a great time. We drank a bunch of beer, but kept pace with water as was our rule. We liked to party, but we always kept it sensible out in the woods. I hear and read so many stories online and on your channel about people that are just friggin' stupid with their drunken antics, and then they wonder why they get into trouble. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. It was getting late, and we needed to get back to camp, and we had stopped at one point on a little island, and Link had left his hat there and didn't remember until we were all the way back at camp. He wanted to go get it, but Heath convinced him to get some food first, and then we'd go back, or maybe even just wait until the next day. I cleaned up the fish, we cooked them over the fire, and we had a couple of beers, but before I broke out more herb, Link insisted we go back and get his hat. It was getting dark, but Heath said okay, and maybe it'd be cool if we saw some of the nighttime animals out doing their thing. We grabbed our shotguns and flashlights, hopped back in the boat, and set off for a nighttime adventure. Alright, I know I'm rambling, but this is where shit goes south. We got back to the island, and the swamp is doing its thing in the night. Lots of turtles were out, we could hear all kinds of birds and critters moving around, and we got to the island, and Link just grabbed his hat and looked off down the river at something. I asked him what was up, and he said, "There's a big fire over there. Can't you see the light it's kicking up?" We both looked, and yep, around a bend in the river, we could see a bright orange light cutting through the dark. Link wanted to check it out, and we said cool, why not? But we drifted down without using the motor so we wouldn't startle anyone there, and actually not let anybody know we were coming. We got closer to the fire and paddled to the far side of the river to see what was up. It's a good thing we did. The fire was coming from two burning crosses. There were about 15 or so guys around the crosses, some in the typical white sheets and others not. One guy was talking, but we couldn't hear him that good, but every once in a while the group would yell out stuff like white power, the usual clan bullshit. Heath shook his head and said, "Man, we better get out of here." I agreed and started to turn the boat around, but then, just like in all of these stories, the dumbest thing happened. Link's paddle slapped the water instead of quietly dipping in, and one of the guys turned to look at the river. At first he didn't say anything, and we all froze. Later I figured he didn't see us right away because he'd been staring at two burning things for such a long time, his eyes didn't have time to adjust to see us in the dark. But his buddy next to him turned around too, and he saw us. How do we know? He yells, "Aw, shit! Looky here, boys!" The whole group turned around and stared at us, and frankly focused on Heath. They started shouting, and the N-word was flying through the dark at us. And I said, "Fuck this," and fired up the motor and started jetting back up the river to our camp, which was about a mile away or so. We were zooming along in the dark, and I couldn't tell if anyone was following us, and the motor was too loud to hear anything anyway. But as soon as we got to the camp, We all jumped out, and I said to pull the skiff up into the woods to hide it from anyone who might come by. We're all kinds of freaking out, and Heath gets a fire going despite Link saying we should keep things in the dark in case they come after us. "We've got our shotguns," I said. "And besides, they're not going to do anything stupid. I mean, we're not that far into the boonies." "We're far out enough for that shit to happen," said Heath. Now, I don't know why we didn't just pack up and get the hell out of there. But we didn't. We had another few beers to calm down and waited to see if anyone came, but no one did. We skipped the weed and stayed up late making sure that we were going to be okay, and finally we felt like everything was going to be all right. We fell asleep, and later in the night, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. Immediately I was wide awake, and I could hear what sounded like 3 or 4 voices whispering. More sounds of footsteps and breaking twigs, and then I knew they were right in our camp. I heard someone open one of our coolers, and someone else was rustling around in our shit. There was some whispering about the darky and some other words I'm not going to say here. Heath tapped my arm to let me know that he was awake too. And then someone walked right by our tent, and I could see and hear him rub against the tent wall fabric. I was freaking out, but quietly reached next to me for my shotgun. In the dark, I could see Heath doing the same thing. I leaned towards him and whispered, "I'm going out there. I don't care." Heath just nodded, and I quickly unzipped the tent door and fairly popped out with my shotgun, and I looked at 4 shapes standing at the edge of our clearing. "Who the hell are you?" I asked as I sensed Heath coming out from the tent. Link did too, and now we're all standing with our shotguns pointed towards the ground as these 4 guys don't say anything. "What do you want?" I asked again, nervous and feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The guys didn't say anything. I mean, this was getting to be a weird standoff, and Heath told them to just get the hell out of there. This drew a laugh, and one of them says, "Shut up, N-word." Right, now I'm angry, and I'm scared, and I'm doing stuff I don't recommend anyone else ever do. I took a step towards them, cycled my 12 gauge, and said, "What the fuck did you just say?" They kind of shuffled back a step, and I took another step towards them. "I don't care who you are or where you're from, go back right now or you're going to see a hospital tonight." Yeah, that's me, Mr. Tough Guy. Link was next to me now and did the same thing. "Get the fuck out of here before I blast your fat redneck ass into next week." One of the guys raised his hand and started to say something, but I told him to shut the fuck up and get out. Heath was now with the 2 of us, and I noticed that our shotguns were now pointed at these guys and no longer pointing at the ground. Slowly, they moved to the river, and we saw that there was a boat there. They all got in, and one yelled back, "You're dead, N-word! We know who you are, N-word!" We heard a motor start, and they moved off down the river. All 3 of us stayed there for quite a while longer, and Link finally said, "I think we better go." I nodded, and we quickly packed up, one of us always keeping an eye on the bank with a shotgun in his hand. The trip back to the trucks in the dark was scary as hell, and we kept looking over our shoulders in the dark to see if anyone was coming. We got back to the business lot, and without incident. By now it was about 5 in the morning, and I said, "Hey, let's go to this diner outside of Slidell." So we drive there, and we're all talking about what had happened and how messed up it was. We parked our trucks, and then we were eating, and that's when Heath noticed that he couldn't find his wallet. He looked everywhere, and then went out to the truck, checking around it, and checking everything that we had packed, but it just wasn't there. He was super pissed, but there wasn't much he could do about it. So we decided to just go home, and I dropped him off at home, and then went back to my place and crashed. We went back the next day looking for it, but it wasn't at the business, and it wasn't at the campsite we had. And I'll tell you what, it took a lot of courage for both of us to go back to that campsite. I didn't talk to Heath for a couple of days, but then he did call me at work and told me that someone came to his house in the night and graffitied all this shit about "Get out, N-word," and "We know where you live." And there was a note in his mailbox in shitty handwriting that said, "You dumb N-word, you left your wallet outside your tent." Heath was going apeshit. He called the cops, but there wasn't much they could do but make out a report, and it ended up being one of the last weeks Heath stayed in our town. He moved to his cousin's in Houston, Texas, and got a job out there, and that's where he is to this day. His parents left town shortly after, and I don't blame them for that either. This was all a long time ago, but it still says something about this world we live in, where there are still hick assholes out doing this kind of stuff. It's scary as hell, and the fact that they showed up at his house is even scarier. As I said, we're all still really good friends, and I'd do anything for my buddy. This was almost 20 years ago, but if I ever found out who those asshole rednecks were, there's gonna be trouble. Camping with Bigfoot by Justin H. I wasn't sure how I was going to start this story. I've always been one to embrace the superstitions in life. When I was growing up, my uncles would tell my brothers and I stories. Stories of how someone who they knew had spotted Bigfoot at the north end of one of the state parks we used to go to. I always thought about that. Thought about going to the north end, where there were trees so thick that at the brightest part of the day, nothing more than a foot's distance from you could be seen. I imagined being brave and venturing into the forest to find a Bigfoot. I never actually did, of course, but probably would have if I ever found my way back. Anyway, this may or may not have had an effect on what happened on the camping trip I'm about to tell you about. I just felt it might be worth mentioning. One thing is certain. If it happened to all of us. We set up camp around noon on a nice late summer day. One of our cousins came with my brothers and uncle on this trip, and it was her first time camping with us. I'm not sure how old we were at the time, but I think I was around 10 or 11. My two brothers, one around 13, the other 7, as well as our cousin who was 13, were all stoked to get to our destination. We loved the sense of adventure when we were with our uncle. He used to pick out various spots deep in the woods to camp, and some of our best times as kids were hanging out and camping with our uncle. This spot in particular, we had been to once before with no eventful occurrences that I can recall. We usually started out the day by finding kindling to add to the wood my uncle would chop for the night's fire, and shortly after arriving and picking up as many sticks as our little arms could carry, my cousin said something which I immediately responded to. She said she felt like someone was watching her. The hairs on the back of my neck were already standing up before this, but after she said it, I got a little scared. We went to meet with my brothers to investigate, and we looked around camp, searching for signs of other people, houses, animals, yet nothing was there. We were in the middle of nowhere, 3+ miles from any road. The day moved on, but something just didn't feel right. I remember feeling like I should have looked over my shoulder constantly. I was getting a bad vibe, something I knew wasn't right. Sure, my cousin having said something earlier didn't help, but why was a sixth sense seemingly telling me something? I just didn't know what it was. After setting up camp, we all decided to go for a walk down this trail that was very close. And after walking for about 10 minutes or so, we came to a clearing. The trail basically stopped and opened into a large field with a single red barn on top of a hill. This was very odd, as there were no houses, let alone roads for a few miles in any direction. And the strange feeling returned, and this time came to all of us. After some deliberation of whether we should check it out, we decided to head back to camp. For the rest of the day, we hung out by the fire and just talked. As night approached and the sun finally set, we stuck close to the fire and started to forget the notion that something strange was going on. Then it happened. My uncle was partially standing and sitting on his car when he felt it move. He said that the front felt like it was dropping, and I remember him thinking it was his brother trying to sneak up on us. Our other uncle was the only one who knew about this particular camping spot. But then it happened again. This time we could easily see the car dip, and it would have taken 3 or 4 men to make it drop that far. The hood was hitting the dirt, and my uncle slid off. Not knowing what to do, we heard thuds of something running behind the car. And we were frozen with fear, and there was nothing we could do. The only weapon we had was an axe, which was laid next to a tree somewhere back there. And then suddenly, the most frightening moment of my life was before me. A huge, dark figure appeared beyond the fire. Still frozen with fright, we could only look at this strange creature as it stared at us with some of the biggest, reddest eyes we had ever seen. I can remember the only visible features on this creature were its red eyes and white hair on top of its broad shoulders. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone. We could hear trees falling as it ran into the dark night. It was moving that fast. And that's when we started to move even faster. We grabbed what we could with our hands, shaking with fear, not knowing if it would return. We jumped into the car, ready to tear away like something fierce, and at that moment, the worst-case scenario happened. The car didn't start. My uncle tried it again. It still wouldn't go. One more time, and nothing. After the 4th attempt, the small Cavalier finally started, and we were gone. We made it back to my uncle's house around 4 in the morning, and we tried to make sense of what had happened, but could only agree that it had to have been a Bigfoot. There was nothing else that the creature resembled. After daybreak and no way to fall asleep with the phenomena that had just happened, we decided to go back for our tents and equipment that we had left. When we arrived, everything looked intact. Searching around the perimeter, we found our cooler tipped over and emptied, with soda and an open loaf of bread scattered across the dirt. One of our tents was on its side. To confirm what we heard that night, there were a number of trees knocked over that were clearly standing the day before. We just gathered everything up without incident and left. Many years have passed, and I have told the story to only a few people. To this very day, not myself, my brothers or cousin have returned to that spot deep in the woods. My uncle went by himself a few years later without any incident. But the supernatural disturbance that could only be defined as Bigfoot still lingers with me. To this day, when I hear a strange story or scary phenomenon, I think of that day and wonder, was it really Bigfoot? Or was it a correlation of events that happened that day, which made an average animal appear to be something more? I guess we will never know. Terror in the woods. For many years, my husband Alan, his brother Sean, and I have enjoyed getting into the great outdoors, which includes a lot of hiking and fishing, especially for my brother-in-law, who considers himself a kind of expert in fly fishing. When we camped by a beautiful, secluded river last spring, Sean was ecstatic. Alan and I woke up early one morning and decided to go for a hike and do some wild strawberry picking. Naturally, Sean declined as he wanted to try his luck again with fly fishing the pristine river next to us. The day turned out to be glorious, so we decided to keep hiking and picking while Sean continued fishing. It was almost twilight when we returned to camp, and as soon as we arrived, I had a feeling that something wasn't right. Our tents were undisturbed and nothing seemed out of place, apart from the fact that Sean was missing. Alan found his line and gear on the banks of the river, and slowly, panic started to creep in. We searched high and low, well into the night, using our flashlights, and just as we were about to give up and call the authorities, we heard yelling coming from the river. We scrambled down the mountain and past the tents, and then skidded to a stop when we saw something emerging from the water. At first, it looked like a mud monster, staggering from out of the water, and then falling to its knees. When Sean's voice groaned loudly, we knew it was him. Alan yelled to me about getting a blanket while he ran over to his brother, and on my way over with the blanket, I saw that Sean was completely naked. He was covered in mud, but when Alan told him to go with him to the river to wash it off, he screamed, "No!" Alan and I looked at each other, not knowing what had happened, as Sean wouldn't speak after that. We wrapped him in the blanket and sat him in front of the fire, and it took a while before he told us what had happened. We had left to go hiking, and Sean had started setting up to fish, when he heard something in the middle of the river, like a gurgling sound. Thinking that it was either a drowning animal or a freak whirlpool, he put on his waders and made his way into the water. He said the last thing that he remembered was being dragged under. While we listened to his story, he began to shudder and shake his head like he was trying to shake off a terrible memory. We pressed him to go on, and he finally blurted out that he had been attacked by some kind of monster. Alan and I looked at each other, obviously thinking the same thing. Sean was hallucinating. We gave him a warm cup of cocoa and soon got him off to sleep. The next morning, Alan was able to take him to the edge of the river to wash the mud off. My blood froze when Alan yelled at me to come over. I couldn't believe the horrible scratches, gouges, and bite marks on Sean's flesh. He looked like he was covered in bizarre markings. There were strange circular rashes on his torso, which Sean explained while sobbing that they were marks left by the monster's tentacles or something. There were strange scratches up and down his legs like he'd been whipped by a cat o' nine tails, and he also had many deep cuts. The freakiest wounds were the bite marks, which looked more like he'd been bitten by a large bird beak. As we cleaned him up and administered first aid, we heard the same strange gurgling, bubbling sound coming from the river. Sean just started screaming and raced up the mountain before he even got dressed. Alan jumped up and started packing our gear without even checking out the creepy sounds, and he said to me, "We're not waiting to find out, let's go." It wasn't long before we raced after Sean back to safety. All three of us still don't have the guts to go back and figure out what happened that day, or what unholy creature lives in that river. Attacked in the Night by Arkansas Ted. This happened in 1991 while I was granted 72-hour liberty in Ecuador due to a successful drug interdiction. There were 4 of us Americans, with 2 Ecuadorian and 2 Peruvian fellows making up our party. One of the Ecuadorian guys asked if we wanted to go camping for a couple of days. Hang out, do some fishing, get drunk. We said hell yeah, and he did know the perfect spot. A rocky outcropping that held a small pool with a freshwater waterfall and a beautiful western beach that laid bare the Pacific Ocean. It was late by the time we got all set up the first night, so we all sacked out to greet a morning and day full of fun, sun, and fishing. The morning was great, and a couple of guys jetted off back to town for the morning market and some paper, rum, beer, frozen squid for bait, and a whole bunch of water. We foraged for wood and got all the fishing gear ready, etc., while those guys were gone. The guys came back with everything needed to eat our asses off, but they got the booze all backwards. They got 1 case of beer and 1 case of rum. The rum came in a triangle bottle that was about as tall and wide as a tall boy beer. It was good, and I've never had any rum like it since. It was tasty. You could almost drink it straight without it taking your breath away. So we fished, drank, and ate like kings all the way into the night, and then kicked back and watched the big screen TV called Our Galaxy while we were jamming out to the local radio station. It was wonderful. The only thing that could have made us any happier is if our women could have been with us. This was mentioned many times throughout the day and evening by everyone. Around 2300 hours, we started hearing howling and barking. One of the Peruvian guy grabbed his Ecuadorian guy friend who suggested the camp location. We looked at each other with that what the fuck look. We thought a fight had started, but no. It turned out the Peruvian guy was from northern Peru that bordered the Amazon, and he knew that sound. Monkeys. They explained that it shouldn't be a problem as long as we kept the fire going and the radio playing. I did mention that we'd been in the sun eating and drinking all day, right? Around 0100 hours, that was my best guess, we were all stone drunk playing some card game. The monkeys had faded into the background in our minds, and I'm saying 0100 hours because that's when all hell broke loose. These strong little motherfuckers attacked us. They jumped on us and started beating our asses. I mean, they chased us to the cars and then went about eating our food and drinking our booze. Now, listen, you've got to understand, these little bastards didn't just grab and run. They came and showed us what they took from us. They threw shit on the windows, screamed at us, pointed their asses at us, broke the radio, then hung out by the fire getting fucked up on our booze. And here are 8 tough guys bleeding and sulking with the windows rolled up, sweating our asses off in the cars. One of the monkeys had dropped an unopened bottle of rum by the car next to me, and I retrieved that, and we passed along the bottle while planning revenge, and knowing we needed water. In the end, we decided to bum rush them, grab the fishing poles to defend ourselves, and as soon as we ran towards them, they bugged out, but not empty-handed. The drunk little bastards. And for your information, monkeys get wasted fast. We ended up laughing it off. I mean, what else could we do? We gathered what was left, hung out, and drank rum and water until we passed out. We never knew if they came back, nor did we care. Hey, they had won fair and square. My advice, never camp where there is a possibility of a monkey invasion. They will stalk you, and they can attack. Especially the ones that jumped us. Heed their name. Calicebus Lucifer. Hey, Campfire crew. Thanks for listening. Summer weather is upon us, and that means it's a perfect time for some hiking and camping stories, so I hope you enjoyed these. If you haven't already, please follow me on social media. Links to that are in the description below, as is a link to my Patreon page. Leave me a tip there if you so care to. Anything helps keep this channel rolling ad-free. Please like and subscribe to my channel and leave me a comment. If you really like what you hear, why not share it with a friend or two and check out all of my other scary videos on this channel. If you've got a true scary story, send it to me. unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. I hope everyone is doing great. Looking at a live campfire coming up in a couple of weeks, so stick around for that. But in the meantime, be excellent to each other. And be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.